the session. Fantastic. So we are now recording. And I'll just give you a quick introduction to this project, Connecting Communities with Peatlands. It is a Just Transition funded project led by Irish Rural Link and the Community Wetlands Forum. And so this project was launched in October just last year, as you know, towards the end of the year, and it's mainly focused as a capacity building training project for community groups in the Midlands area. And really, you know, when we're talking about just transition, there are all these massive changes happening in the Midlands at the moment with the halt of peat extraction industrially. We're starting to kind of move away from fossil fuels in general and looking towards having sustainable environments and economies more locally. And this is a massive, massive change for community groups to navigate. And this particular project hopes to provide capacity building training to community groups to be able to navigate that change and to include peatlands in our future, as they've been so important to us in our past. So really, that's kind of where we are now with this webinar series, Build Your Bog Knowledge. We did a needs assessment training or a training needs assessment last year, just before Christmas. And what really came out of that was that communities really wanted to build their knowledge and understanding of peatlands themselves. So I've worked with a lot of the contributors, so the ones that are here today and the ones that will be participating in other webinars over the next few weeks, to put together a accessible, comprehensive webinar series that will hopefully give you the knowledge and understanding that you've been looking for, and will contribute to you know, your own understanding and skills going forward in the peatland field. So tonight, as you know, we're talking about what is a bog. Next week, we're looking at the plants and animals of the bog, and then taking a break for Easter and coming back then on the 26th of April and looking at peatlands and culture. And then following on from that, we also look at the important role of peatlands in climate regulation and restoration of peatlands. And then finally, we look at what community groups can do with their own peatlands. And that's from examples of what's already happening around the country and in the Midlands. So I think that's it for me. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Nuala, our first speaker, to share her screen. So Nuala is a representative of the Irish Peatlands Conservation Council and will introduce peatland formation, exploring the unique characteristics of what makes a bog a bog. So take it away, Nuala. Thank you.
Thanks, Aoife, and good evening, everyone. As Aoife said, my name is Nuala. I work at the Irish Peatland Conservation Council. We're a charity here in Ireland, and our aim is to conserve a representative sample of peatlands for people today and future generations to enjoy. This is our headquarters at the Bog of Allen Nature Centre. Everyone's more than welcome to visit us there. It's based in Kildare. We own and manage in partnerships 6 peatland nature reserves nationally. And our work is guided by peatland conservation action plans. Our 7th action plan was published in 2021, and it's known as Peatlands and Climate Change. But of course, this should be read in conjunction with our Peatlands Halting the Loss of Peatland Biodiversity Action Plan. You can learn lots more about our work on our website, ipcc.ie. So approximately 20% of the land surface of Ireland is bogland. This is IPCC's very rough map of Ireland, of where you might find our boglands. And this evening, we're going to explore 3 different types this evening: blanket bog, raised bog, and fen habitats. But I suppose first off, what is a bog? Well, bogs are also known as peatlands. I often say to young students that I meet, you know, locally we call them bogs, but if the Bogs of Ireland went on holidays, it would be a peatland on their passport, the name. And it's a good way for young people to remember that. And of course, they're wetlands. They're 90% water and only 10% dead and decaying plants. They once covered an area of over 1 million hectares on the island of Ireland, and they're also acidic in nature. What is peat? Well, it's the results of accumulation of partially decayed plants over thousands of years. And we're going to explore in a short while, I suppose, how these plants actually accumulated. The dead plants don't decompose because they grow in very waterlogged conditions. So bog, as I said, is 90% water. And because of this, there's very little oxygen beneath the surface of a bogland. And this prevents bacteria and fungi, the agents of decay, from working. And I suppose this is why there's such a great carbon store, which you're going to explore in another of the webinars at a later date. Healthy peatlands have a water table within around 20 centimetres of the surface throughout the year. And sphagnum moss is the main peat forming plant. It grows 1 millimetre a year, so they're super slow at growing, and it stores 20 times its own weight in water. We know sphagnum moss, and you can refer to it as the bog builder in Ireland. So the peatland types then, so we're going to focus on 3 of them this evening. So we've got our fen habitats, our raised bogs, and our blanket bogs. And blanket bogs are divided then into 2 further ones, Atlantic blanket bogs and upland or mountain blanket bogs. And these are just 3, some of the images of them then. And I think one of the things when you look at these 4 images here, one of the characteristics is that peatlands are very wide and open landscapes. So I always say to visitors coming to a bog, you know, you have to prepare for the Irish weather because there's certainly no shelter on a bog. All the plants are typically low growing on them, and of course they're very wet, so strong footwear is always advised when going to your local peatland site. So what is a fen? We'll start with this one. A fen is a wetland system, and it has a permanently high water table. It's at or just below the surface. Its principal source of nutrients is really from groundwater, and they're alkaline in nature. So fens are different to blanket and raised bogs in that they dominantly get dominantly their water from the groundwater, and that's why they're still alkaline in nature, because they're still in contact with our groundwater, and much of the vegetation is dominated by sedges. Their formation started about 10,000 years ago. If we go back then and we think of Ireland, you know, we were in the grips of an ice age. Although it sometimes feels like that in Ireland today, we're not in the grips of an ice age anymore. So we went through a climate change. Climate change is something that's natural. It's happening all around us. It's our weather changing. And 10,000 years ago, we went through a weather change. And our weather became warmer, and this ultimately melted the ice. And throughout Ireland, with this large volume of ice melting, shallow pools were created. And this is really the first stage of fen formation, but also we'll see in a little while how this leads into raised bog formation. Naturally, over time, plants colonize these lakes, and every year the pollinators pollinate their flowers, and they have their fruits, and they spread their seeds, and you know, the leaf litter in autumn time dies back, and year on year, over thousands of years, eventually what happens here is these lakes completely infill to create a fen, and that's what creates the water table that's at or just below the surface, and it's a lake filled in with dead plants, but it's still in contact with groundwater. So where do you find the fens in Ireland? Well, they're found throughout Ireland, typically in limestone-rich areas, most commonly in the west and the Midlands of Ireland. The original extent of fens in Ireland is about 92,000 hectares. And fen habitats have been impacted by reclamation for land. This involves drainage, fertilisation, reclamation and removal of peat. The MPWS, as far as aware, are currently completing a national fen inventory to better learn about their extent and their condition today in Ireland. So fens started 10,000 years ago, and they formed from these lakes that were left at the end of the last ice stage, building up an accumulation of plant material. And this brings us into our second type of peatlands that we have that were most common with found in the Midlands of Ireland. And these are our raised bogs. So raised bogs are typically got a dome-shaped masses of acid peat, and they occupy former lakes. They can be up to 12 meters deep, and they have also been growing for the past 10,000 years. What's different about a raised bog now comparing to a fen is that raised bogs are no longer in contact with groundwater, and their principal source of water now is from rainfall. Their characteristics includes that they're low growing. It's a very open vegetation dominated by mosses and sedges and heathers, and all of which are adapted to these waterlogged, acidic and exposed conditions. So let's have a look at raised bog formation. Well, we have to go back again to 10,000 years ago with these lakes left behind at the end of the last ice age. As I mentioned with fens, these lakes naturally filled in, their leaf litter in autumn building up, the plants multiplying every year. And something I probably should have said is a good way to think about it is if you have a garden pond at home, every few years you have to go in and clean out that pond from the autumn leaves that have fallen into it or the plants that are growing. Otherwise, the garden pond will get filled up with plants, and that's a natural process. Although from like a fen and raised bogs, it takes much longer than that for the size of these lakes. And ultimately, it took about 3,000 years for our lakes to fill up to create a fen, and we see that on stage 3 there, and they were around in Ireland around 7,000 years ago. While we do have fens in Ireland, these fens have a continuous supply of groundwater flowing into them, and that's maintaining those alkaline conditions. In other times, sometimes there was no groundwater flowing into these lakes, and they continued their growth into raised bogs. And if we come forward now to 4,000 years ago, at this point, most of the island now is covered in trees. It was very much so a wilderness. But 4,000 years ago, we actually went through a second climate change. Remember, 10,000 years ago, we had this warming of our climate. Ireland, I suppose, isn't known for the best weather. So at some point that had to change. And it did change 4,000 years ago when we got this more temperate climate, a lot more rainfall in this country, which really suits bog growth. And lots of wind during the winter time and even during the summer sometimes. Ultimately, these trees that were growing over these very wet environments could no longer survive. At this time, we know so much about these trees is because today you might even find them on your local bog, buried beneath the bog, these large oak, pine and yew trees that once carpeted our landscape are preserved in our peatlands. And of course, when the trees fell, they allowed for a very special moss to grow, which I'm sure you're going to explore further when you look at the biodiversity of our boglands. But that moss is our bog building moss, sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss, it grows upwards about 1 millimeter a year, storing water. And this constant growth gets to where we are today with our raised bogs. This growth of sphagnum moss upwards have given them the fact that they are about 10 to 12 meters deep. They're no longer in contact now with groundwater at this point because the sphagnum moss has grown up over the thousands of years. So their principal source of water is rainfall, and they're now acidic in nature. And that's actually, partly because they're no longer in contact with our alkaline groundwater, but also because of these sphagnum mosses with this very funny ion exchange program where they're pumping out hydrogen onto the bog surface. So raised bogs are typically found in Ireland in the Midlands, but also in Northern Ireland and our lower Bann Valley. The original extent of raised bogs were over 300,000 hectares. But again, similar to fens, we have benefited from our peatlands, from the extraction of peat, the generate for electricity, for domestic fuel and for horticulture. And also we've drained and we've also afforested some of our peatlands, and this has resulted in some of their losses. Approximately about 10% of the original area of raised bogs are conserved in Ireland today. So what are blanket bogs? Well, we have two main different types of blanket bogs, and these are bogs that are generally found in our mountainous area, and they're Atlantic and mountain blanket bog. They get over 1,200 millimetres of rainfall. Atlantic blanket bog is found from about sea level to an altitude of about 200 metres, where mountain blanket bogs are found above that 200-metre altitude. They're typically kind of more grassy appearance than our raised bogs, but they've got a patterned surfaces of pools, flat slope areas, flushes and swallow holes, and they're important features within our blanket bogs. And then, of course, in our mountain blanket bogs, we get lots of heathers, crowberry and bilberry, and natural drains and lakes and flushes. So again, they keep this characteristic open landscape. So how did blanket bog forms? Well, while fens and raised bogs were over 10,000 years old, blanket bogs are much younger. They're still pretty old at 4,000 years old. And we believe that actually humans had an impact on their development. And we take the example of the Cajun Fields in Mayo. We found a whole network of farming landscape beneath these blanket bogs in the west. So what do we think happened? Well, potentially we had these trees growing all over most of Ireland 4,000 years ago. Early settlers had to find land, so they cut down some of these trees in the uplands. But one of the elements with this was that our climate was about to change, and we were to get more rain and wind, the typical temperate climate we have today. And with this, we get most of the rainfall in our mountains, over 1,200 millimetres. This rainfall, as it continued to fall, began to push minerals down through the soil, creating beneath the soil what we know today is an iron pan layer. It's impermeable to water, so water can no longer soak down through the mineral soil. And in turn, it begins to build up above this iron pan layer, waterlogging the soil above it. And in turn, this allows, of course, our bog building sphagnum moss to grow. And of course, sphagnum moss, it grows upwards a millimetre a year, holding 10 times its own weight in water. And when we look at it, when we look at the blanket bogs, because they're a bit younger, they're not as deep as our raised bogs. They're only about 4 to 6 metres deep. And of course, we find them in our upland mountains. So where do we find them? It's most widespread blanket bog habitat. And of course, we mainly find them in the west, but it's not to say we don't have them in the Midlands and our Slieve Bloom Mountains, or indeed in the east, in our Wicklow Mountains. The original extent of blanket bog was over 700,000 hectares. And similarly, blanket bog habitat has experienced losses, again, from peat extraction for fuel, electricity and horticulture, drainage, land reclamation, invasive species overgrazing, and afforestation have all contributed to blanket bog habitat loss. And approximately about 25% of the original area of blanket bogs are protected. So let's summarize these 3 types of bogs. So as I said, we have our fens. The pH of a fen is alkaline, but we compare that to our raised and blanket bogs, who are fed by rainfall now and have those sphagnum mosses. That's lowering the pH of our boglands. Annual rainfall then, fens have between 800 and 900 millimetres, as do raised bogs. Remember, these were typically in the Midlands and the fens in the limestone areas, but blanket bogs, they have over 1,200 millimetres of rainfall. Again, where do we get them? So raised bogs in the Midlands and throughout the Bann Valley, blanket bogs in our mountainous areas, and fens, lake shores, rivers, Midlands, limestone areas. Peat depth. So fens are very shallow. They can be up to 2 metres deep. Raised bogs are the deepest, up to 12 metres. And again, remember, raised bogs continued their growth from that fen stage 7,000 years ago, where blanket bogs, which only started to form 4,000 years ago, started to have about 2 to 6 metres. We look at their formations from their lake basins and indeed from the mineral soil. They have a variety of habitats present within these, from fens, which have fen-car, woodlands, quaking vegetation. Raised bogs are typically made up of this hummock hollow system, pools, and bog woodland. And of course, blanket bogs, similarly, hummock hollows, lakes. And the original areas then we believe to be about 92,000 hectares of fen, over 300,000 hectares of raised bog, and over 774,000 hectares of blanket bog. So why are we talking about bogs? Well, I couldn't end my presentation without saying that traditionally we valued a peat for only what was beneath our feet. But today we know so much more about the values of Irish bogs, and these are referred to as the ecosystem services. And that's the benefits we all obtain from nature. Peatlands have a rich, diverse habitat for biodiversity, really important for water regulation. Remember, the Sphagnum Moss store water, you know, preventing flooding, and also helping to slowly release the water into our waterways. The carbon storage, which you're going to explore later on in the webinar series, a source of food. People years ago used to collect cranberries and bogs. Recreational opportunities. We see how the outdoors is so important to us after COVID-19, and our peatlands are such an open and wild landscape to explore. They're an inspiration to artists and poets. Seamus Heaney, the well-known Irish poet, described our peatlands as Ireland's unfenced country. Of course, they're an economic resource that we as a nation and people have benefited from for over 400 years. And of course, they're a land bank for agriculture and forestry. I'd like you to thank you for inviting me to be part of your presentation this evening. And you can learn more about the work of the Irish Peatland Conservation Council on our website, ibcc.ie, or indeed follow us on our social media. So for now, I'd say farewell.
Thanks so much, Nuala. That was really good, really comprehensive. And the images as well always help. I'm a visual learner, so I hope that's helped a lot of other people as well to see the formation. It's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to invite our next speaker, Maurice, if you'd like to share your screen, and you can work away whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Aoife. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Looks like I'm sharing. Okay, so if you're a visual learner, if you're in for a treat here, so lots of images. Yeah, thanks a million. It's a real honour to be here today and to be talking to the Community Wetlands Forum, because I think we in the National Parks and Wildlife Service and government in general, and my department really do appreciate that to pursue our nature conservation targets and aims and ambitions, we really do need to engage with communities, and they are just a linchpin of how we're going to move forward in terms of peatland and bog conservation. So my talk is Nuala gave a lovely introduction there, and she's laid the groundwork for me, which is now going to dwell mostly on the raised bogs, in particular the mapping and monitoring of Ireland's raised bogs, which is a responsibility that as the scientific authority, the National Parks and Wildlife Service have to the Habitats Directive. Okay, so just covering a little bit of ground that Nuala has comprehensively covered, peatlands, fens, blanket bogs and raised bogs, and I've highlighted there, it's only the raised bogs that I'm going to talk about. And there's a map, the yellow you'll see in the map of Ireland there, that this is John Connolly, produced in 2009. You can see all of the yellow, so, and covered a lot of the country, even up as far northeast to where I live, close to RD Bogs. Again, Una had a more accurate figure than me, but we think that the original raised bogs in Ireland were about 310,000 hectares. There's another image of them. You can see that purple coded, those polygons, is effectively where they were, mostly in the Midlands and a little bit into the west as well, in Galway and Roscommon, those areas. But fast forward to 2010, and you can see that those large, expansive areas of raised bog deep in the Midlands have now massively dwindled. And what we have is a much more patchy, peppered distribution of our raised bog network. So massive diminishment of our raised bogs, which is why now it's so important that we do protect what's left. And the final image here is just to illustrate the network of designated sites, which are special areas of conservation, the Natura 2000 Habitats Directive sites, and natural heritage areas, which are the national bog designations under national legislation under the Wildlife Act. You can't quite see the legend there, but the red are the SACs and the blue are the natural heritage areas. And when you get down to this level, they really do, it's a very peppered and very patchy network. And just to give a few figures there, the raised bog network, which we, the National Parks and Wildlife Service, are trying our best to protect and enhance and restore. There's 61 SACs plus 2 large sites, mostly owned by Pnha, waiting designation, and then we have 75 natural heritage areas. And that under a review in 2014, a government review, it was decided that we would better protect our natural heritage area, the network, by de-designating some natural heritage areas, but then designating some new ones which were in better condition and less turf cutting, etc. And if that, we're still waiting for the Wildlife Amendment Bill of 2016 to be enacted and to go through the Dáil to fully bring that to fruition. And just a lot of my talk from here on in is about the mapping. As at the outset, I said that it's to talk about how we scientifically map our raised bogs, and that image there is Pnha colour. So I'm not going to dwell on that because I'll be developing that a wee bit more, but that's a typical map of a raised bog in Ireland. So just briefly, plant communities in raised bog, what do they comprise of? And I think most people in the webinar today would be, if you've been on a bog, you'll have seen what they look like, and you'll have seen lots of heather. And just pointing the heather there, Cluna vulgaris or ling heather, which is the very common heather. It's actually, if there's too much Cluna, it's a bad thing. It's a sign that the bog is probably drying out a little bit. But the species we really do well, and as Nuala said, is the bog moss or the sphagnum. This particular one, typically the small red species is Sphagnum Moss, probably the most common bog moss on a raised bog. We want lots of that. The more of that, the better. And then there's a few other species, hairsteel, cotton grass. So we work based on plant communities. We developed in Ireland. I wasn't there at the time. It was the 1990s, working with Dutch scientists. We developed in Ireland a bespoke system, a unique system of mapping our raised bogs. So we base them on ecotopes based on plant communities. And if anybody wants more details, you could go onto our website and look at this document, Raised Bog Monitoring and Assessment Survey 2013. And there are details in there of how it happens. And there's also reports for lots of raised bogs in general sense, on a specific sense. Then just want to highlight the EU annexed habitats. So we have this obligation to protect our raised bogs in terms of the EU annexed habitats. And there are 4 of those which you would typically find on a raised bog, and maybe on the cutover bog. The first one is active raised bog. That's the really important one. That's the one where you get lots of bog pools, lots of sphagnum. Next one I've shown there is bog woodland. This is typically a drier habitat, lots of birch, but also these lovely big hummocks of sphagnum, a very different species from which you would find on the high bog, and other bryophytes or other moss species as well. Probably my favourite habitat, actually. Depressions and peat substrates of the Ringtosporian. It's very difficult to actually map that, and we don't tend to map it. We just assume that it's within a complex of active raised bog. But there's an image of some, I think that's Cultivan bog. There might be people from Cultivan here. I know the fantastic bog. And the Ringtosporian there refers to the white-beaked sage, Ringtospora alba. And finally, degraded raised bog, which that's the technical name for that is degraded raised bog, which can be, after 30 years or less possibly, can be restored to active raised bog. So these annexed habitats, and we can transmute them into this unique habitat system, mapping system we have in Ireland. And it's based on 5 ecotopes. You can see them there from 1 to 5, from dry on the left to very wet and very high conservation stats on the right. So face bank, marginal and submarginal, they may or may not be degraded raised bog according to the Habitats Directive. And then active raised bog, and that the subcentral and the central always are the annexed habitat. I'm getting into maybe a little bit more, too much detail here, but I think the 5 slides here to illustrate them a little bit more detail. I'm not going to spend too long, but just there's a typical picture, and some of these pictures, by the way, are by courtesy of Joanne Denier, who's a really top ecologist and has done lots of work on raised bogs. So face bank ecotope, very dry, as you can see there. And as I said earlier, lots of Cluna, lots of ling heather. That's a bad sign when there's so much of it. No sphagnum whatsoever. Marginal ecotope, so you rise up from the face bank where there used to be turf cutting. Sometimes maybe there still is, although there shouldn't be. And as you get closer to the centre of the bog, you get this marginal ecotope. You're starting to get a little bit of sphagnum, but the ground is still pretty hard and quite a lot of heather still. Then submarginal ecotope, this sphagnum, bog moss is starting to appear in higher percentages, 10 to 30 there. And the ground is getting a little bit soft and the sphagnum is diminishing. Next, subcentral, this is the annexed habitat. Sphagnum cover is really increased, it's 30 to 60% there. ground is nice and soft as well. And finally, central ecotope. If you go to place bogs like this, is very relatively uncommon these days. You'd have to go to a really good bog. You might have to go to Clara, Garisco, Mongan Bog, Carradecki, to see Shankill West is another good one, to see really expansive areas of sphagnum coming up to 100% and or bog pools and a lovely micro topography. So that's the ecotope types. Then we go out and we map them. And I say we do. I don't do it myself. I haven't ever done it, believe it or not. Typically, it's contractors, people like Fernando Fernandez. We lots of people in the community Wetlands Forum know well. George Smith, Joanne Denier, already mentioned. Lots of top ecologists with the real. It's quite a detailed. It's quite a resource demanding. It takes a bit of learning, and you really do have to know your ecology and your plant species. But this is Clone Crew Bog, a real favourite of mine. There may be some people from Turtles Pass here. Hope so. But it's a lovely bog. This ecotope map is quite simple, which is kind of useful because it shows, hopefully my mouse will show you there, the only area of active annexed bog on this on Clone Crew is actually this area, sort of, I suppose, in the middle of the bog, and that's sub-central ecotope. The most of the bog is actually sub-marginal. Then there's marginal around the face bank itself, and then there would be face bank habitat. And there's just a picture of it from the air. You can see this, so I'm showing you here the sub-central in pink, and you can see a very obvious signature here, a yellow or a brighter pattern or colour, and that means there's lots of sphagnum there. And the sub-marginal, which is dominated by heather, is a kind of a brown colour. So that's not the annexed habitat. It may be degraded raised bog, okay, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. We do also, that's the raised bog, the high bog, but just to complicate things a little bit more, since the Living Bog Life project, which had its end of life conference recently, George Smith and William Crowley was the ecologist in that project. They developed a new habitat classification for cutover raised bogs for the first time ever, which is brilliant and probably unlikely that any other European countries have it. But so we have this method now of mapping our cutovers. And there's, again, lots of lovely colours. I'll just point the legend here. It doesn't, HAS1, as somebody said to me, doesn't mean high-speed train. It means high sphagnum. LS1 is low sphagnum and MS is medium sphagnum. So it's quite simple in many ways, but again, you need to be a really good ecologist to map them out. But we map the cutover bog, and that gives us lots of information about the baseline conditions. And then if we go to restore the bog, which we did in late 2020, we know what was there before, and we can go back to this bog, maybe within the 6-year reporting cycle to the Habitat Directive, and map it again and see how things have improved. And this has already been done at a bog like Abbey Leaks Bog, probably very, very well studied bog at this stage. A lot of it, this work was done, this particular survey was done by Fernando Fernandez and Willie Crowley. 2020, this report, they remapped Abbey Leaks Bog in 2020, and they also reviewed the surveys and maps that were carried out in 2009, 2014, and 2020. And the survey in 2009, I hope I'm right in saying, was just after the bog had been restored. And I've just highlighted here the sub-central ecotope. So in 2009, just after restoration, it was slightly over 1 hectare. In 2014, it was over 3 hectares. And then, wow, 2020, almost 14 hectares, which is quite an incredible improvement. So if we restore a bog, we really can improve their conservation status for the good, for Ireland's commitments and for everybody's appreciation. I'm not going to dwell on this at all, because I know there's later in the series there's going to be somebody's going to talk about greenhouse gas emissions. But we also have work done by Shane Regan and Clara. We now have emissions factors for all of our ecotopes, and if you apply those emission factors to the habitats which were mapped at Abbey Leaks Bog, we know in 2009 the subcentral was a carbon. It was a sink. It was taking in carbon dioxide at the rate of minus 2.1 tons of CO2 per year. But in 2020, because of the increase in active raised bog, it's now taken in at 25 tons of CO2 per year. And just there's a lovely, in this report, which Fernando and Willie did, there's a lovely comment there that says, if you take into account an average car in Ireland emits 2.9 tons of CO2 per year, the reduction we've seen at Abbey Lakes relates to equates to about 81 fewer cars on the road, which is good by any standards. Back to Aoife's comments, if you like pictures, here we go, just to put that in picture context. In 2009, if you look at the yellow and the blue, the yellow is submarginal, the blue is subcentral. 2014, the yellow submarginal has increased as well, which is good. It's away from marginal ecotopia. And then the blue, the subcentral, which is active raised bog, has increased a little bit more. And then, and here's the best picture of all. 2020, you can see the blue, or the subcentral active raised bog habitat, is very significantly increased. Degraded raised bog, I'm conscious I'm getting close to the end of my talk, so I just wanted to mention degraded raised bog in Ireland. We've applied a unique system of defining degraded raised bog. It's actually, you can't do it on the ground. It's based on a model, typically a LiDAR, based on LiDAR, and then you develop a digital terrain model from that. And based on the topography and the flow paths on the bog, we can determine where active raised bog should be if the bog was fully restored. And you can see the pixelated polygons there are the degraded raised bog, and then the orange area, which I showed you earlier, is the current active raised bog, the subcentral ecotopia. So if we block all of these drains and take away those trees, hopefully we should expand the degraded raised bog and should become active raised bog. Just the conservation status of raised bogs. All Irish bogs, and Nuala pointed this out, there's been subject to, over the years, to lots of turf cutting, to land reclamation. So there's no single bog in Ireland is actually in a good conservation status, or well, some of them would be in good conservation condition, I should say, but altogether the collective network of raised bogs and the resource generally in Ireland, because of all of the historical drainage, turf cutting, land reclamation issues, and even these days climate change possibly, because of all of those issues, the overall conservation status of raised bogs is bad and declining. So we really do have to do lots of restoration work to turn that around. And to do the restoration, it is pretty simple sometimes. You just get a machine on there and you block the drains, and you can re-wet. As we've seen at Abbey Lakes, the results can be quite impressive. Favourite of mine, and one that Nuala's very familiar with, is Gurley Bog. This is a UAV or a drone imagery, and you can see the sort of the grey signature there. That's open water. So by building these bunds on the cutover at Gurley Bog, we've been able to capture and retain much more water, and the sphagnum will soon, quite soon, within a couple of years, will colonise and terrestrialise all of the area, hopefully, if we can keep the water level high. Knock Collar Bog, I showed a picture of that at the very start. Here's some contour bunding on the high bog, and you can see again the obvious results. And finally, in this one, All Saints Bog, an area with some fantastic bog woodland on the high bog, but this was an area was operated by Peat, a horticultural company, for quite some time. But we bought it about 20 years ago, rather. The department bought it, and we've now started restoration there. And you can see by building these cell bunds, it's very effective. You can see the amount of, we don't want deep water, by the way. The water there, it looks deep, but it's actually very shallow. And we do want to keep it as shallow as we can, 10 centimetres above ground level. And that allows us for some fluctuation in dry summers where it's likely to drop to maybe surface level or even below surface level. But that's okay for sphagnum to regenerate. And finally, probably just to go back to this, the living bog, I mentioned it. Willie Crowley is the ecologist, and that is just about come to an end. It's about finished, but the 6 years that they were in operation, they did some really good work. And Ronan Casey, the public awareness officer, some of you probably met Ronan, a really enthusiastic bog person, and they did great work. And this is just an image I took from Ronan of a day they were celebrating on Muller Bog, or Killiconny Bog in Muller. So thanks, Gorma, August Tonkabogi.
Thank you so much, Maurice. I love the play on language there at the end. No, that was really, really fascinating. Thank you so much for presenting. And I'm sorry, I actually didn't introduce you properly before you started speaking, but I think it's quite obvious that, you know, your presentation was focusing on how our Irish raised bogs are mapped and how we can use that mapping then for successful restoration works So thank you again, really appreciate it. So our next speaker is Annette Lynch. She's also with National Parks and Wildlife Service and working with the Ecological Assessment Unit. So Annette is presenting a piece on the right project in the right place, and understanding the site designation, regulation and ecological assessment processes. So this will kind of outline, I suppose, what community groups need to be aware of when they're considering a project within a designated site. So Annette, if you want to take it away there.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, no. Is that okay there? Is that the right view?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And I'm delighted to be asked to talk to you tonight. And I wish to thank the Community Wetlands Forum for inviting me along. My topic may not be as exciting, even from Aoife's talk there, regulation doesn't sound as exciting as the last two excellent presentations, but an important topic nonetheless. So what I'm going to really talk about is the right project in the right place, and what maybe you might like to consider if you're considering a project in a peatland site. I will give you an overview of basically, and maybe point you in the right direction if you're thinking of a project in a peatland. How will you find out if your site is designated? I mean, as Maurice showed you there, he showed you all the designated sites, but there are other peatland sites that you may have nearby that aren't designated. So in relation to your project, what does this mean? I'll also give you an outline of what kind of consents you might need to consider from either MPWS or maybe the local authority. And what environmental assessments you may need to carry out before carrying out a project to make sure that any project you do will be in line with, I suppose, the conservation objectives of the site. So close to my heart would be Bog. I'm quite close to that. I was a conservation rangers with National Park for years and worked quite closely with the community group at Bog. It's a nice, smallish kind of bog. And basically, I'm just going to draw your attention to this here. As you heard from the previous speakers, hydrology is the most important bit for bogs. So trees are not so good because obviously they take away a lot of the moisture from the bog. But in times gone by, they were used a lot for planting conifer trees. And this is a quilcher plantation of conifer trees. I think that photo, I can't remember what year it is, but it's going back maybe 2005. It could be. But I will talk a little bit more if you just have a look at that outline there, and when I go on to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit more. So how will you find if you're looking at a protected site is one of the listed protected sites? If you go to the National Parks and Wildlife Service www.npws.ie website, you will come to a list of protected sites. It'll give you whether you have a natural heritage area, special area conservation. You can either search by a code or by a county name, or sometimes easier is just to bring up the map. There's a map of all the designated sites we have in Ireland, and you can just zoom in to your particular location. And for our case example here, I'm just using Bog again, and it just shows you the blue outline there is a natural heritage area that was designated in 2003. And as Maurice said earlier, a natural heritage area is designated under the Wildlife Amendment Act. So it's an Irish designation. And as I showed you that piece there where the Quilcha trees were, Quilcha carried out a project. It was an EU Life funded project. And part of that was to restore Gurley Bog by removing those trees and not replanting them with conifers. So that was a project that they carried out. And part of that project was that it would become an international site. So it's a bit unusual in that you have one portion of it as a special area of conservation under European legislation, and the rest of it is under a national. So some of your bogs may be like that as well, where, you know, a part of it is SAC or a part could be an NHA, or it may be all just an NHA, or it may be all just a special area conservation. In reality, it doesn't really make a lot of difference because the legislation for both is quite strong in the protection, but it's just something to be aware of anyway. So that's to figure out if your site is designated. That's a good way. Or you can contact your local conservation ranger. They're always very helpful as well. But the MPWS website will direct you. So next is if you're carrying out a project, you might need to consider, well, what consents do I need consents, I suppose. So if we look at the designated sites, first of all, it's statutory instruments that designate special areas of conservation or a natural heritage area. And basically in those statutory instruments, it'll tell you about the site, what it's designated for, but it'll also tell you what kind of works or activities require consent. And that's consent from the minister, our minister, which presently is the Minister for Housing. And that's where MPWS sits at the moment. So to get those consents, you would contact your local, you consult with your local conservation ranger or your local regional staff in MPWS. So just to give you an example of some of the types of works, for obvious reasons, in the Gurley Bog, as my example is here, there'd be about 22 listed works that would require consent. Peat extraction for obvious reasons, commercial recreational activities, constructions of fences, the planting of trees. And as we talked earlier about getting the right project in the right place, we always think planting trees is good for the environment, but in some situations, and on wetland sites in particular, the trees take the moisture away, and that's not what you want on the bog. So you would not be planting trees, obviously, on the raised bog or in some of the other habitats, even around the bog, because it will draw the water away from the bog. So that is one thing that would require consent, is to ensure that the trees, if you're planting, are somewhere that are not going to affect the hydrology of the bog. I suppose most of the restoration works is generally carried out by either a public body, but some community groups, I think, have undertaken to do their own drain blocking as well. So these kind of activities would require ministerial consent. I know, you know, we've had the talk where blocking your drains is obviously good for the bog, so why do you need consent? But it's about just getting the right drains blocked in the right locations. I think there's a lot of science and hydrology into where they locate, a lot of where they put those dams in on a bog. So that's just something else to be aware of. A lot in this in Gurley Bog, it's there's a lot of little, actually before it was designated, there was a very active local man who was a bit ahead of his time, and he saw the beauty of bogs. He didn't see them as a dumping ground that a lot of other people had seen them at. And so he was well ahead of his time, and he had set up, I think in the early 90s, a sort of a community group where they removed all the litter and the dumping. I think there was incredible amount of dumping that was taken out of the bog. But following on from that, it became quite a local area for general walking. A lot of access routes, I suppose the old bog roads into it, were used just for walking and just generally enjoying nature. Since then, I suppose Girly Bog is, I suppose, nearly a victim of its own success because it's become quite popular. It's on the National Trails list. So with that, I suppose it's just something to bear in mind. If you have more people coming to a bog, because they're wetland sites, they generally can get very muddy, and you may get hazards then accumulating that you may not have had before if it was just used by maybe a smaller number of people. Now, I know this photo doesn't maybe show it too well, but this particular area did get very muddy and it was a bit of a hazard, a slip hazard. So in, I think it was 2016 maybe, a stone path was put in just to protect it. Now, the reason I'm just showing this slide is just showing, if you can see in the slide here, the path is only really taking in what was the original footprint of the walkway. Now, the contractor who did this he's particularly good. He's very used to working in sensitive locations, and he did not impact in any great way any of the lovely habitat. You see, around bogs, you have the raised bog is over here. I hope you can see my cursor moving there, but the raised bog is over to the left. But all around the bog, you'll have different habitats. So you'll have bits of woodland, or you'll have bits of grassland. You'll have, because a lot of the bog roads, they brought in limestone. So you may have more calcium-like plants growing in these areas that you won't get on the high bog. So there is ecology benefits around these areas as well. So it's important to protect them. Or maybe it's just a case of putting up some nice signage in your bog, something simple. Maurice, who gave our last talk, did a lot of the artwork and some of these signs, so he's got many hidden talents. But it could be just simple, something as simple as that, just putting up a sign to make people aware. In relation to other types of consent, I was talking there mainly about activities requiring consent or works requiring consent under the Irish and the habitats regulations. But something to be aware, if you're going for a bigger project, is your project may need planning consent. Now, again, if it is a designated site and you're talking with your local ranger, they may be able to advise you, or you talk to your local planning officials as to what requires planning. Some stuff is exempted, some not, but certainly large structures may need planning, so something to be aware of. So now we'll just take a look at what environmental assessments you might need to carry out before carrying out a project in the peatland site. So if it's a European site, or if your project is likely to affect a European site, you're looking at the Habitats Directive and the Habitats Regulations. And that's called, you'll hear this term quite a lot, appropriate assessment, or shortened to AA. And basically a Natura impact statement is drawn up where it looks at your project, what is likely to be the impacts of that project, but importantly, for this particular appropriate assessment, you're only looking at the impacts to what the site is designated for. So the designation for a raised bog is the active raised bog or degraded raised bog. So that's all it's really looking at in the appropriate assessment. So whether your project is going to affect the hydrology of the bog and the plants and species that are there. So like these lovely species, but I think you're getting a bigger in-depth talk on all the plants and animals associated with a bog, but they are unique to that habitat because of the acid and high water content. So as I was saying, with appropriate assessment, you are really only looking at what the site is designated for. But in an environmental impact assessment, you're looking much more at wider environmental parameters, like the habitats that are surrounding the bog. You have other parameters to consider. You have the social, the cultural aspects. So all of those, if you're looking at a project, it's unlikely that it would require an environmental impact assessment. They're usually quite bigger projects, but it's something to be aware of. They call it screening for environmental impact assessment. And certainly roads, if you were putting a brand new road into a bog that wasn't there before, it's very likely, it could screen in for environmental impact assessment. a climate change and all these things are considered in an environmental impact assessment report. But it would certainly be beyond the ARC or the works, because it would be a planning issue. You'd be dealing with your local authority there, which would be the advice for those types of projects. But if we look at this access road, I suppose if you have to think, if you're going to a bog, if you put in a big stone structure, are you losing the very essence of why people want to go to the bog in the first place? Is there a need? So always be thinking, is there really a need for me to stone it, and what benefit are you going to get? Because the habitats that are on either side of this will be, you know, they're diverse, they're slightly different from the raised bog. So even if you are considering to do a project in these areas and it doesn't require an environmental impact assessment, a lot of local authorities, if it requires planning, will still look, it's not statutory, but they will look for an ecological impact assessment. And I think I would strongly recommend any project that you would have some kind of ecological impact assessment done, because you don't want to lose the very essence of what the bog is about. So to understand what ecology you have can be very beneficial for the community going forward. And as I explained, on the side of some of these access routes, you get a blaze of wildflowers that you're not getting on the high bog. So you have a different biodiversity. You have butterflies, bees, all sorts of. So my advice is sometimes keep it simple. You know, sometimes taking on big projects. I know in Gurley Bog, I think we learned quite a few lessons of sometimes when more people go to a site, there's more work in managing the site. There's more work in managing the trails and tracks. Who's going to do that? And sometimes that can become a little bit of a headache. So sometimes keeping it simple, keeping it local can be good as well. You can use them, they're absolute great places for local schools to go out, because there's such diversity that they can learn in a nice, quiet location, learn about the butterflies on their bog, learn about the animals. Because it's a wetland site, you will always have tadpoles and newts in the small pools or drains around the bog, and children just love to be able to see these things up close. So in conclusion, I suppose the first thing is to check if your location or your peatland site has a designation, whether it's an NHA, Natural Heritage Area, or a special area of conservation. So you can check on the MPWS website or contact your local regional MPWS staff. It's important to check if consents are required before you start on your project. And again, checking with your local National Parks and Wildlife staff if the site is designated. And then environmental assessments will be required. Some will be statutory, like AA or EIA, or ecological impact assessment. If in the county development plan, of course, sometimes they require ecological impact assessments, and that kind of makes them statutory then. And for sites not designated, just check with your local authority or planning office, because they may not be exempted and they may need planning permission. Thank you for listening, and remember, less is often more.
Thanks so much, Annette. Thank you very much for that really, really practical and useful information, I think. Thanks to all of our speakers, our contributors, for presenting. I'm going to move it now to questions, and there are a good few in the chat at the moment. So I'll start with one in the chat, but if anyone does want to virtually raise their hand through the raise hand function, please do, and that'll draw my attention to you and you can ask a question directly if you want. So I think the first question here was put into the chat when Nuala was speaking. is there anything specific about the geology under fens that causes them to form?
I'm no geologist, but I know from the, from what we would describe at the bottom of our bogs and fens, we've something known as marl. I describe it to young people as the kind of the dead fish and bones and snails, a kind of a deposit that's quite impermeable to water. So it's like the plug in a basin or a sink, and that's what kind of holds the water there. Excuse me now, it's kind of like a clay that hardens, so it's quite when you kind of extract it, it kind of hardens like a clay, but I don't think you'd use it for modeling or anything like making pottery or anything like that. But that's really what I believe to be at the bottom of our peatlands. And apologies, I did notice there that my sound wasn't great as well, so apologies about that.
Yeah, just to follow up on those, yeah, I mean, most of our fens, and Nuala had a great picture of it there, but they're not exclusively, but they are in the Carboniferous limestone, the big Carboniferous limestone block in the middle. New Orleans like a saucer. It's lowlands limestone in the middle, which is alkaline, lots of calcium carbonate, and then surrounded by mountains, much more acidic granites and metamorphic rocks. So that limey, and which creates the marl mud as well, that gives you, it means that there's still some slightly lime-rich groundwater feeding the fen. So the geology is absolutely important. So it means that it can't develop into all the time. There's hydrological reasons as well. It can't develop into a raised bog because it's just not acid enough sometimes. A good fen, really, you get all of those lovely alkaline brown mosses rather than the sphagnum mosses, which are more acidic.
Great, thank you. Another question is about the Bog of Allen, and if anyone can define the extent of the Bog of Allen. Nuala, you might have an idea on this.
Well, I don't know the exact extent. I would always describe as the Bog of Allen really being a complex of bogs. I know a lot of people, would believe it to be just one big bog. But if you look at the Midlands of Ireland, it's a mosaic of raised bog habitat. And we always say that it stretches, it starts in the east of the country and encompasses the 11 counties in the Midlands of Ireland, stretching right across into East Galway. But I wouldn't have any idea of the extent because I know we do have, you'll find raised bogs, in other areas outside of that as well. So I don't know whether you can get a raised bog in County Kerry. So I don't know if you'd include what the figure would be in terms of that. But I would always have described the Bog of Allen as really the Midlands of Ireland. It's a mosaic of raised bogs encompassing 11 counties. But someone, Maurice or Annette, you might have more of a better definition than myself.
No, I'll go with that for sure.
Fantastic. One of the questions here actually is about what is our best example of bog restoration? And I know, Maurice, you gave us some really good examples in your presentation, particularly Abbey Leaks Bog, but I suppose there are probably several others that are excellent examples. Yeah,
that's where the glass is half full. The glass half empty bit is, a lot of our good bogs have gone, and there still are turf cutting issues. But we really have a very progressive and comprehensive restoration program in the department, mostly funded came originally from out of the Climate Action Plan, and more recently from the Carbon Tax Fund, actually. So I think we have been working on about 20 bogs in the last 3 years. So a lot of work going on there, but some you might, they're not all easy to access, which is a big problem. But the one in terms of the ones that probably have best, Abbey Leaks is a good example. Another one is Ardagullion comes to mind, and the 12 bogs that the Living Bog project work on, of those for Ban, which is County Laois. Oh, I think so. And then Carnagopple, hopefully, sorry, yeah, it is. Yeah, and then Carnagopple up oh God, that's Galway, near Mount Bellew there. I think that's another really good bog and public access. But I guess just in terms of getting to a bog, I did show Cloncrow. If you go to the west side of Cloncrow, you'll see the work that we did there. And of course, Gurley Bog as well, including the property of the Irish Peatlands Conservation Council. That was actually, that image it shows was actually the IPCC's land. And Abbey Leaks, yeah, I need one. So that's some good news there for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's more and more adding to that list, I think, every year. This one I'd say, Annette, is for you. How
Okay.
does a Pnha progress to an Nha status?
Well, I suppose the good news for peatlands is that I think all our Pnha, if I'm right, Maurice, have, in relation to peatlands, have all been designated formally as an Nha. And I suppose how they're formally designated is you get the statutory instrument. But to go through that designation process, you have to notify landowners, and then they're given time to object and before they're formally designated. All the other Pnhas, maybe I think it's Anne there who might be referring to, like there's a lot of lakes, what other sites? We have a large number of PNH, proposed natural heritage areas, and they just haven't got legal status as yet, because I suppose the department has been so involved with the SAC, the Special Areas of Conservation, because they were European. There was a lot of pressure on Ireland to get those formally designated. It's quite a long and lengthy process. We would love to see the Pnhas come on board, and there would be a lot of fens actually in that as well. But and hopefully they will, because I suppose the SACs are coming, they're all being formally designated now. So maybe that will progress in the future. So that's it. But for the peatland sites, all would be designated as Nhas at this stage. They were the first ones to be put forward as national designations.
Yeah, there's a good few questions around, the designation of sites. Someone else has asked, do sites ever get their designations updated, or I suppose updated or upgraded? They say I understand curlew nest on bogs, but are not designated on any, or there's no designation on those particular bogs.
Yeah. As I say, because it's such it is quite a lengthy process, and you have to have the landowners involved. So, there's generally reluctance to kind of redesignate an already existing one by maybe extending areas, because you have to go through a very large and lengthy process. I don't know whether that would obviously be a brand new site that as Kyle is referring to there, where it has no designation at all. I suppose Pnhas are generally, the only protection they get would be through the statutory county development plans. A lot of development plans sort of say that they will prevent any developments in or around without those ecological impact assessments I was talking about. They would review a lot of the Pnhas, quite areas of high nature value, basically, in county development plans. So that's some way they get protection. And for the curlew, I suppose, obviously there is a survey of curlew, and if any nest is known, they would be protected, I suppose, on the bog. But to get a brand new designation can be tricky enough, to be honest.
Thanks, Annette. There's another question here on how many bogs are still being used for commercial extraction, but I don't know if we can answer that. Like, I know I wouldn't have a figure on how many are still being used in the private industry, private sector. I don't know if any of you guys can answer that or have a ballpark figure.
Nuala, do you? Of course, there shouldn't be any, really, but
I don't. It's difficult. One of the, I suppose, the challenges is that peat extraction on a large scale does require permission, planning permission to do that. And I suppose one of the challenges we have in Ireland at the moment is it is one, very challenging for the operators to get a license. It's a lengthy process, but that also is challenging protection and conservation of bogs. So it's my understanding, with the exception maybe of Bord na Móna, there was no peat operators with an actual license at the moment. And if you don't have a license, we don't know the extent of that development on and the action that's going on our peatlands. So I don't have a definitive answer for that, but it's a challenge on our peatlands, so it is, that needs to be addressed.
Sorry, for the question was, sorry, I wasn't looking at the question. I did previously, but there've been a few. It was, commercial, sorry, yeah. Of course, there's still quite a bit of domestic turf cutting as well, but the commercial, yeah, I don't think we know. Of course, good news is Bord na Móna don't anymore, and they're a very large, significant portion of the whole complex.
Yeah, like that actually leads into another question that's there around, domestic turf cutting, like and happening on designated sites, I suppose. How do we deal with illegal turf cutting that are happening on designated sites?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of time, and I think Annette touched on it. It kicks it into planning. If you need an EIA or an AA screening, which generally you would if there's any degree, any large, reasonable degree. But I don't know if you wanted to go back to the press, say 2011-12, the National Parks and Wildlife Service made a determined effort to stop turf cutting on our SACs after there was a 10-year derogation allowed in about 2001. And that, kicked the can down the road significantly for all that period. Then when we tried to stop it, it became quite fractious. So a lot of conflict. It was an RTE one. First time ever I've seen the bogs making the headlines in RTE one. Was it 6-1 the news? So it's very, very problematic. And we have been trying to do it. And there's, there used to be tens of thousands of people cutting within our designated site, but now it's down to about 280, I think, is the figure. So that's, relatively speaking, not a lot, but or you could say that's still 280 too much. But it's a very problematic issue. Okay, and it's been particularly in the last week or so. It's been highlighted in terms of people not being allowed to cut anymore in Bog na Móra bogs, as I understand it. So yeah, that's a difficult question with it. Be difficult to answer, to be honest. Yeah.
I think a lot of resources have been put in place, though, to support turf cutters who have moved away from that traditional activity in our bogs. There was a compensation scheme put in place that turf cutters could avail of. And Maurice, I don't know, but I would hope that scheme is still available for any turf cutter out there that is still cutting on a bog, that they could come forward to avail of that compensation scheme today.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I don't deal with it, but absolutely. And then, of course, there's the Peatlands community engagement scheme, which equally encourages people to promote and appreciate their bog, and that hopefully would encourage others to stop the turf cut. I think you're right. That should have been my answer to some extent. No, it's very much it's a carrot on a stick approach, but the carrot is particularly important these days because we tried the stick approach about 10 years ago, and it all became a bit messy and very problematic, politically as well as practically.
Yeah. Another question here from Maureen. What is causing heathers to die on some bogs? If anyone wants to take that.
I'd say drying out, definitely. So if you, that would encourage heather. But there's conversely, if we do, as the point I was trying to get to, if we block the drains and restore the bogs, the heather actually will diminish and the sphagnum will increase. So that's probably not the question you're asking quite. But there's a heather beetle as well. I've seen it only once actually in Ireland, in Mount Heavy bog near Kinnegad, and there's a particular species of beetle which can wipe out heather over extensive areas. So that might be the issue in some particular areas. I think it's a very it comes and goes. It's an ephemeral kind of phenomenon. Some years it's significant. You don't see it for any time. Some years you don't see it at all. And it's not something I'm particularly familiar with. But that's probably, if you're seeing definite wide-scale death of heather, it's probably the heather beetle.
I think that is all of the questions so far. If anyone does want to raise their hand or hop in and ask a question. I think everyone is really shy on a Tuesday evening. I don't think I've ever seen so many questions in a chat box. There's some people that have had to hop off and stuff like that, and saying thank you for the presentations. And there's someone there actually asking if it's possible to get to the slides. So we'll have the recording of this available. So it'll be all on video, so you'll have access to them then.
I'm happy to re-record if you can't hear me in my talk. Apologies again about that.
I'll double check that, Nuala. But I think you should be okay. The volume on mine was fairly good. So fingers crossed. There's a couple, I think, more questions coming in. No, I think people are grand. Yeah, they could hear you fine in the end, Nuala. So not to worry, you don't have to go back and do another re-recording. Maurice, sorry, you were going to say something.
Somebody asked about books. I remember I probably started off with David Bellamy's The Bogs of Ireland, or The Boglands of Ireland, isn't it? I think it's a really, really approachable. It's probably very difficult to get these days. It was published in the mid-1980s, I think. But David Bellamy's book is a very, very gentle introduction to bogs in general. And then if you wanted to go to John Feehan's, a much bigger book, I think it's The Bogs of Ireland. Bellamy's is The Boglands of Ireland, but it's very, very comprehensive. It deals a lot with the commercial stuff, but there's some really good bits. And then, of course, just go onto the IPCC's website and lots of resources there, including some publications. I think you can buy them, presumably still, but that's as good a portal as any, I'd say, as an introduction.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's some questions there about how to get involved if you have no kind of prior experience. You know, you can get in touch with myself with the running this Connecting Communities with Peatlands. You know, we're trying to support new groups and individuals who have never engaged with peatlands before to begin doing that process. So we're there to give a helping hand. You can contact me at aoife@irishrurallink.ie, and I've popped that as well into the chat, so the email address is there. Are there any other comments then, and we can wrap it up on this lovely Tuesday evening?
I think I'd just like to say congratulations on this initiative. You know, well done. I think it's going to be a fantastic resource, you know, for communities in our peatland areas around Ireland to learn about the bogs. So I think well done to yourself and all.
Thank you so much, Nuala. We have some people that are like, nope, I am asking questions now before we can run off. Jamie, you have your hand up there if you want to unmute.
Oh yeah, great talks from everyone, Nuala and Maurice and Annette. Just a quick one there, Maurice. Point of clarification: you said 280 turf cutters. Are they illegally cutting on the SACs?
Yeah, I couldn't actually say that. Some may or may not be now, to be honest. So yeah, I think that's out there somewhere, isn't it? The recent report, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
And there's another comment here from David saying that the crane has returned to Ireland after 300 years. And with the rewilding of the bogs around Bora, are there other species returning that we don't hear of widely? We will actually be covering a lot of the plants and animal species next week in next week's webinar. But if you guys want to answer that, if you know of any particular species that we should be seeing returning.
I think I said in the chat, I'd love to see the bittern return, which probably as much as that the Bun and Bui, the lovely, the yellow bittern, that lovely poem by Cahill McGonigal, I think it is, and translated by Shimasini and Thomas McDonough. Marsh harrier, yeah, and of course the hen harrier is doing okay here and there. So.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, you'll have to tune in next week on the 12th of April at 7:30 to find out more about different species of animals that'll be returning to our bogs. I'd like to thank our speakers very much. You know, really appreciate it, and really comprehensive presentations. And thanks to everyone who came today and joined us this evening. So take care, everyone. Thanks a mil. We have it recorded. It'll be out on our YouTube, and I'll be able to send you all on a link. So that's it. Have a really nice evening. Great. And I'll see you all soon.
Night, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.